This is Winnie McCroy from Queerful.com, and I'm here with Kevin Burns, longtime executive director of Action Wellness. And Kevin, congratulations. On March 25th, you are going to be awarded with the Fierce and Fabulous Award from the AIDS Fund. We'll start there. Can you tell us a little bit about that honor?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you. I am very honored to get this award. I have been, in addition to my role as executive director of Action Wellness, I've had a very close association with the folks at the AIDS Fund who, in my opinion, they're really the fierce and fabulous folks. They've done an amazing job over the years. And they do all kinds of fundraising events. They do the AIDS Walk here in Philly, and also Gay Bingo, which has been hugely successful.
Very popular. I know you have drag queens calling the numbers. It's a hit.
It is a hit. It is a hit. And, you know, those events and their efforts raise money that allow us to access emergency needs funds for our clients. One of the things I admire the most about the AIDS Fund is they've, over the years, really pivoted and changed as the epidemic has changed and as the needs of our clients have changed. In the early years, the AIDS Fund would make grants available to AIDS service organizations. And that was vital money we needed. We were just all starting up, and funding was a challenge for all of us, which it still is. But once that became less of a need, the AIDS Fund and with the decrease here in Philly of the AIDS Walk in terms of participation and the amount of money they were raising, the AIDS Fund board took a really hard look at where were the gaps that they could fill. And that's when they pivoted, instead of funding organizations, to providing a fund that was accessible for all of us for direct client emergency needs. And it's been a lifesaver for our clients. It's much more flexible than a lot of the government emergency needs applications and funding. So it's a long-winded way of saying I think everybody associated with the AIDS Fund is fierce and fabulous, and that's what makes receiving this award even more. It touches my heart. It is really meaningful to me because of my admiration of all of them.
That is so wonderful, Kevin. And when you talk back in the day, you're talking 1986. You started as a volunteer buddy with, it was called ActionAIDS back then, and eventually worked your way to the top. And you served as executive director for 18 of the 34 years that you worked there. And I remember I worked for the HIV press at that time, and it went from a death sentence to something that people could address with medication, could live, fairly unhampered lives. And I wanted to ask you, looking back, what do you think of the long view of this, and what stigmas still remain?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Winnie. I mean, you're absolutely right. In the early days of ActionAIDS, we were really doing hospice work. People didn't have a lot of hope of surviving HIV. And it's one of the things I'm so proud to have able to play a small part in us getting HIV to the point where it can be a manageable disease. That if people have access to really good care and treatment and the support services that they need, they can have a normal life expectancy. That was unthinkable back in 1986, in 1985. I think the real benchmarks were, finding medications that worked really well. And I can remember so many of my clients when I was a case manager who were on massive doses of AZT. It was just, we would not be where we're at without the sacrifices that all of those clients made who participated in clinical trials. And boy, what they would have given for a chance to have an undetectable viral load and a normal T cell count, and to be able to focus on wellness as opposed to surviving. That's one of the reasons why we changed our name from ActionAIDS to Action Wellness. We wanted to communicate that our focus was on helping people to achieve wellness, and that was an attainable goal. That is no small thing. And it really has been a privilege and an honor of my lifetime to have played a small part in getting us to the place where we're at today.
Absolutely. And when you look at things like that, and when we spoke of AZT, I instantly cringed because I remembered just the ravages that it did to people's bodies back then. And there were a lot of lowlights, but throughout your time there were a lot of highlights too, and you were involved in some wonderful things in 3 decades with Action Wellness. What are some of the highlights that you can recall?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the highlights have always been focused around clients and clients making progress. Um, we're very fortunate. We have a small number of clients who have been living with HIV for 30 plus years. And the fact that we've gotten them to this point is a huge highlight for me. And I think the relationships I've made, I mean, I think people in the queer community and people in the HIV community are the absolute best people in the world. I've met some amazing people who have been passionate about doing work around social justice and equity for people with HIV and for people in our community, people in the queer community. We've come a long way. Action Wellness has always been working on that social justice front. The fact that as a gay man, I can marry my husband. Who would have ever thought that in 1983, right? So as much as there have been sort of valleys, there have been lots of peaks around advancing social justice and equity for people with HIV and people in the queer community. I will walk away from my 34 years at Action Wellness with a full heart and grateful for the relationships. Philadelphia is an amazing city because all of the service organizations, the LGBTQ organizations, and the HIV organizations do work together. And that's been amazing to see that grow and develop over the years. And I think for all of us, we see the place that we're at in terms of the care and treatment of people with HIV. We wouldn't have gotten there if we didn't all band together, and that includes organizations like ACT UP. In the early years, we depended on ACT UP to keep us in the limelight, to make sure that the issues of injustice were being addressed. And then those of us working within organizations, we would coordinate with ACT UP. So, we were sort of working from the inside to change the system, and they were the force outside of the system making things happen. So it was really exciting, to be a part of that movement and to see how far we've come. The Brian White legislation was huge for us. We finally got some funding from the federal government to provide the services that we need for clients. Our eligibility as a 340B covered entity also brings revenue and savings to our clients, as well as money to fill the gaps of funding from government. So it feels like I think the AIDS service organizations are in a strong position now, and we need to keep fighting. We need to keep making sure that HIV is a priority until it doesn't need to be anymore, until it's not an issue anymore.
Exactly. And it really occurs to me, Kevin, when you talk about working from the inside with ACT UP, working from the outside, talk about being on the inside. You have been on the inside of so many of these organizations. On the in your lifetime of activism, you have served as a board member for Dining Out for Life, chair of the Circle of Care Advisor Board, the board of directors of the Pennsylvania AIDS Law Project, Pennsylvania Coalition for AIDS Services, and the AIDS Fund. And then, as you mentioned, you served on the Ryan White Planning Council from 2002 to 2018. This stuff doesn't just happen. It takes a big sacrifice and a big chunk of your time. And I wanted to ask why it's so important to you to serve your community in this way.
Winnie, in the early days of AIDS, I had many friends who got sick and died. And at the time I was working as a therapist in a mental health center. And that's when I started volunteering as a volunteer buddy, buddy for ActionAIDS. But it really felt like I wanted to do more, that I needed to do more. And I really started at Action Wellness as a case manager in a way to give back to the friends I had lost and to say something about that their lives mattered, that those losses are part of what fueled me to want to do more and to want to. And I remember at the time, ActionAIDS was a very young organization and the salaries weren't terrific. They're still not great, but they're better than they were. And my husband, my partner at the time, was a nurse, and he also volunteered with ActionAIDS. And we sat down and we looked at our finances. It was like, you know what, you can go and work there full time for a couple of years. We'll be fine. After the first year, I was already in love with the organization and the work and our clients, and we made it work, and I never intended for this to be my life's work, but I'm so thankful that it has been. And yeah, it's been a terrific experience for me. I feel like I've gotten so much more than I've given, and again, mostly around relationships, with clients who I may have made their journey a little bit easier as their death and dying process in the early days. And then I see clients today who are flourishing. We have a client who came to us who was agoraphobic and was not getting care and treatment for his HIV because he just couldn't bring himself to leave his home. And so we worked with him over a long period of time to get him connected with primary care, to get him, the therapy he needed to address his agoraphobia, to get him out of the house. His partner and he worked very hard around that stuff. And so fast forward 15 years, he is working full time, has had several promotions, is healthy, his HIV, he's undetectable, his amazing story, and ended up being on our board of directors and giving, because again, I think people have this desire and this passion to give back. And that's what I think has kept us going and kept me going all these years, is the folks that I've established relationships with who are also wanting to continue to give back and to stay involved. That's a really long-winded answer to your question.
Okay. I see, Kevin, when you talk about that 30 years ago when you joined this nascent organization, to have it evolve from something that provided hospice care when others were unwilling, frankly, to do it, to now being an organization that people who are living with HIV and AIDS can tap for case management services, for recovery services after prison, primary medical care, to be linked with other resources, for housing, for buddies, for pregnancy care, for employment, for educational services. I think that it's so important that Action Wellness offers all this to the Philadelphia community, rather than just relying on the government to fill in, these primary services. And you touched on that a little bit earlier, as far as filling in that gap. Without this, what would these same success stories emerge, do you think?
I don't think so. And, especially looking back at the early years, nobody cared about people with AIDS. The government didn't care. How many years did it take before Ronald Reagan, as our president, even uttered the word AIDS?
He wouldn't even say it.
Exactly. And so I think it was about, and I think there are some lessons learned from those early years that we need to look to in terms of the struggles we're having today. When you look at what's happening with all the rollbacks in Florida and Texas and the attacks on our community, we need to just say, we're not going to take it. We're not going to stand for it. We're going to say gay, Governor DeSantis, whether you like hearing it or not. And I think some of those we need to revive, some of the tactics that ACT UP used to hold people accountable and to make people step up and do the right thing, because our government is never going to do the right thing on their own. We have to force them to do it, right? We have to hold them accountable. And so I think there are some really important lessons from back then that I find sort of energizing, that we should maybe revisit and use in terms of our activism today. And I'm actually looking forward to once I retire, having some free time to get more involved, in local politics, and to sort of push that agenda a little bit, that we can do better than what we're doing now across the country, not just in Florida and Texas, but, the hate that is out there and the misinformation has to be addressed. And we need to be the ones to do it and say, no, here is the truth. This is what matters, that we need to be supporting one another in spite of our differences and not attacking one another. So
absolutely. And I love that there's a two-pronged approach at work here, that you are taking the tact of advocacy and to be out there fighting for this, but you're also not sitting on your laurels waiting for the government to cut a check. Action Wellness is famed for their events. We talked a little bit earlier about the AIDS Walk. We talked a little bit about Action Wellness Dining Out for Life. That's coming up on April 27th. That raises money for HIV funding, having raised more than $100,000 last year alone. And I want to ask you a little bit about that. How is this event, which began 32 years ago, now woven into the fabric of Action Wellness?
Yeah, so it is an amazing event. And years ago, we had a volunteer who came up with this idea. She had done some work in restaurants, and the restaurant community here in Philadelphia was really impacted by AIDS in the early days. A lot of the servers and cooks and people who worked in restaurants. And her idea was, let's have one night a year where the restaurants can help us raise money to provide support services for people with AIDS. And that's how the whole idea came back, that the restaurants would donate 33% of what they brought in that night back to ActionAIDS at the time, Action Wellness now. And so here's a really good example. So, and it worked. It was amazing how quickly the restaurant community in Philadelphia stepped up and wanted to do this event. And it has grown over the years. So ActionAIDS trademarked Dining Out for Life so that we could own it, if you will. And then we ended up selling the trademark for $1 to a national organization, which is now Dining Out for Life International. And we did that because we wanted the event to happen in cities all across the country. And so, and it does now. It happens.
It's got legs, I will tell you that much. And why shouldn't it? For people who want to help, and if they can go out and have a nice meal and it helps somebody else, of course, why wouldn't they do that? It's genius.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so nationally, it raises $3 million a year. That's money that all of us need to continue to grow, you know? So, and it's such a fun event. Everybody enjoys it. You know, you go out, you have a nice dinner. We have ambassadors who are our volunteers and staff at all of the restaurants to tell diners a little bit about the work that we're doing and the work that they're doing by simply dining out for life that night and supporting our work. It's a fun event, and across the country, you know, people at AIDS service organizations that do the event are very passionate about it with good cause. And so, yeah, it is. And I think it's another example of how, and I think this is true for AIDS service organizations and queer organizations across the country. We love sharing our successes with one another and supporting one another and helping one another to grow and to have a greater impact. It's one of the things I love the most about the queer community. We're always there for one another, and that's what it should be all about, right?
Absolutely. I see that also when Action Wellness steps out in Philly for the annual AIDS Walk. You guys have one of the largest teams. I know the 37th AIDS Walk is coming up on October 15th. And I wanted to ask for people who maybe think that AIDS Walks aren't important anymore, or that's so 90s or something like that. Why is it important that people continue to support AIDS Walks, to raise funds, and to complete these walks?
You know, that's an excellent question. And as we are coming out of COVID, hopefully, right, I think it's more important than ever because it's an opportunity to be together as a community, to have our voices heard about the importance of services for people with HIV. It's, you know, it's an opportunity to build community, to recommit ourselves to, you know, what we started this work for in the early days. And usually in Philly, it's usually, you know, it's a little bit cooler at the time of year when they do it. So it's a perfect day. It's a perfect Sunday to go out and take a walk with your friends. And it's healthy for you. It's healthy for the community. It's building community. It's energizing the community and the people who are doing this work on the front lines every day. It's also a wonderful thing for people living with HIV to do. It's, again, it's, you know, it's a healthy part of living with HIV is getting exercise and getting out and being with people. You had mentioned earlier, and we hadn't talked about, you know, the stigma in the early days was horrible, and it still exists. You know, there are still people who come from a place where they believe that HIV is a punishment for a lifestyle or for, you know, having the disease of an addiction. And that stigma, I think people have gotten better at hiding their biases around that stuff than they were in the early days, but it still exists and it still has an impact in the same way as internalized racism and white supremacy impact all of us. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done around that, and even more so because of the environment that we're all struggling to thrive in, so stigma is still, we have a relatively new program working with people with opioid addiction. There is so much judgment around our clients who have the disease of opioid addiction, in terms of how people view them, and not understanding that it's a disease, and not understanding what people with addiction need to achieve recovery, to even be attracted to the idea of wanting recovery for themselves. That's a tough road, and people need much more support around that. And again, the stigma is there. We have here in Philadelphia been trying to get a safe injection site started, and the resistance to that has been fierce. And we're still fighting it. We're pushing, because having a supervised injection site is an opportunity, first off, to keep people alive long enough to achieve recovery, right? But also a way to start to build relationships and networks that will make recovery more attractive for people who are struggling with addiction. So, yeah, I think stigma, unfortunately, is part of human nature, right? And people have these judgments that come from all kinds of crazy, from you or my perspective, from all kind of crazy places. But we need to have opportunities to address those beliefs and start to tear them down and replace them with respect for people, regardless of where they're at in their journey,
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of that comes also from not recognizing or not knowing where this kind of thing springs from. I look at it with the blaming thing of opioid addiction is a good point. A lot of those people, it wasn't even their fault. They were prescribed medication by a doctor that ended up being incredibly addictive, and it got to the point where they couldn't afford their pills, or they couldn't get prescribed them, and they had to go to street drugs. And it was something that was it's an epidemic that was manufactured for the profit of one family. So it really is sickening when you look at that. And I think you need to look at the history of that. And when I look at the AIDS walk, part of a lot of AIDS walks is to put panels of the AIDS memorial quilt down for people to see. I know that National AIDS Memorial will come and curate some. Younger people might not be familiar with the quilt and its significance, that each of these panels represents a life, a flourishing life that was lost in this epidemic. And I wanted to ask you, why is it so important that we show folks who might not know how things used to be?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think you're absolutely right. The panels from the Names Project. The other thing that the AIDS Fund does, at every walk, they have these street signs that show the history of HIV and AIDS. And I think visual things like the Names panel and that timeline is a terrific way to really communicate to our young people what it was like in the early days, and why we're walking, and why we're doing this work every day. And it can be, I think, something that motivates young people to maintain the momentum that we have to move forward, and to maintain our commitment to eliminating AIDS, eliminating HIV one day, eliminating the stigma around addictions. All of that. AIDS has been this sort of intersection of poverty and addiction and homophobia and racism and white supremacy. And it's such, I think, that intersection provides so many opportunities for change. And I think that educating our young people, I recently spoke at a high school here in Philadelphia. This is an amazing school. For the juniors and seniors, they are reading Angels in America. And so they wanted someone to come and talk with them about what was it like in 1985 to be doing this work, and what were we seeing. And these kids were so energized by the conversation. And I think it gave them a whole different understanding, because it is a much different world that we're living in today. And one of the kids after my little talk, um, raised her hand and asked, how do you find something that you feel like you can commit to the way that I had committed, and so many people had committed to working in HIV? And it was interesting. It was such a great question. And I thought, my answer was, for me, it was finding something that really made me angry about the injustice that I was seeing my friends experience and people in my community experience. And that anger, I was able to turn around and use to motivate me to get more involved in the work and to get passionate about the work, and also to learn, how do you change people's minds? My anger isn't going to change someone's mind, but if I can learn more about what's going on and have a conversation and educate them, then I have a chance of changing their mind. So all of those things, I think, are so important. We need to energize now, I think more than ever, with all the stuff going on in the world. We need to energize our young people to get passionate about something and then to do something to make a difference.
Absolutely. I feel like when you find that fire, it can be a really motivating force for you. Now, I know you're going to retire this summer, Kevin, and you spoke earlier about maybe taking some of that fire that you had and going into politics to help change people's minds. So as we close up this interview, I want to ask, what's the next act for Kevin Burns?
Yeah, so I would like to be able to do more volunteer work with political campaigns, get more involved with those. My plan immediately, so my husband retired at the beginning of the pandemic, and he's been making all kinds of travel plans for us. We have a little camper van, so we're going to go on some extended trips across the country and maybe into Canada. We also are the recent proud parents of 2 puppies. So that will keep me busy. So I will take a little bit of downtime and then re-energize. And my thinking is that I think after a year or so, I want to give the new executive director here a chance to get their legs under them and to get established. I'm thinking after maybe a year off, I'll go back to where I started and volunteer again to be a volunteer buddy here at Action Wellness, because that will give me that one-on-one contact with one of Action Wellness clients that I can provide that kind of practical and emotional support. So I see a combination of some volunteer work, some travel, some playtime with the puppies, and then I also am going to do a small. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, so I'll probably do a small private practice as well, just a small number of clients, just to keep me connected with people.
I just love this synchronicity and the fact that you are just coming full circle right back to do it again.
Yeah.
Kevin, you're a longtime executive director of Action Wellness. You're going to be honored on March 25th. So I encourage everyone to come down and see those honors and play some black tie bingo and get those prizes. Thank you so much for sharing your story and for sharing your life with the people of Philadelphia and of our country to make everyone's life a little bit better.
Winnie, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you. I've enjoyed every moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Have a great week.
Thanks, you too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.